I'm Samantha Foster, and this is Venus Mastermind, a space for honest reflection, pattern breaking, and sovereign thinking. I'm not here to perform or to teach in a formal way. This is a shared reflection, a place to think out loud, to name what's been living in me, and to speak honestly about what I'm seeing and integrating. There's no agenda here beyond truth and presence. If something here resonates, take what's yours and leave the rest. Welcome back. Today we step into level 1 of the self-led path, self-empowerment core. And before we go anywhere, I want to sit with what this level actually is, because I spent years reaching for the version of empowerment the world was selling, and it never quite delivered what it promised. I had to learn what it actually was the long way, through living it, through losing it, through coming back to it. Empowerment isn't a feeling we sink into. It's a foundation we settle on. It isn't the gentle confidence that comes after the work is done. And honestly, I think that's why so many of us stay stuck. We're waiting for empowerment to feel like something it was never going to feel like. Empowerment is the ignition. It's the moment we look at our life and say, I no longer want to live like this. And we don't know what's on the other side. We don't have a plan. We don't have a map. But something in us has decided quietly and completely that we're going to find out. That's the level we're stepping into today, not the quiet foundation, the moment of crossing. And the question I keep coming back to with this work, the one that lives underneath this whole level, is one we may have been asking quietly for a long time, in 1,000 small ways, without ever putting it into words. Am I willing to be the one who changes? Not should I, not what if, not how, just am I willing? Because that's the only question that actually matters at this stage. Everything else, the shadow work, the body integration, the archetypes, the sovereignty, none of it happens without that willingness. The willingness is the fire. And once we say yes to it, there's no turning back. So let's sit with what we're actually talking about when we say empowerment.
What empowerment actually is.
Empowerment is one of those words I've sat with for a long time because I felt like I had a real relationship with it. We've heard the word so many times in marketing, in motivational language, in books, in those little quotes that float through our feeds with sunsets behind them, that it stopped pointing to anything real. It got softened. It got commodified. It became a vibe. And for a long stretch of my own life, I was reaching for that softer version, looking for the feeling, trying to find the moment when I'd suddenly feel empowered, like it would just arrive one day, and I'd know. That moment never came, not the way I expected it to. What I came to learn, and this took me years and several seasons of life, is that empowerment isn't a feeling that arrives. Empowerment is the moment we refuse to keep living a life that doesn't fit. That's it. That's the whole thing. And I know that sounds plain. The first time I really sat with it, I almost didn't trust it because it sounded too plain. Because I've watched it in my own life, and I've watched it in the lives of people close to me, and the pattern keeps showing up the same way. Empowerment is a decision made somewhere inside us, a quiet, sometimes ordinary decision that the version of our life we've been living isn't going to hold anymore, and we're done trying to make it. Most of us know that moment. We've felt it. Maybe it came in the middle of a conversation we'd had 100 times before. when we suddenly couldn't do it again. Maybe it came at 3 a.m. when the house was quiet and we couldn't pretend anymore. Maybe it came after years of small recognitions stacking up until one of them was the one that tipped us. That moment is the doorway, and the doorway doesn't open into clarity. It opens into the unknown. We don't get to see the other side first. We don't get to preview the new life and decide if it's worth it. We have to step through without the map. And then the new life starts to assemble itself around the version of us that was willing to step. That's the empowerment, the stepping, not the arriving. And there's a piece of this that gets missed. And missing it is one of the reasons most of us stall.
Self-empowerment is not stepping into your power.
There are actually two different kinds of stepping, and we've been treating them like they're the same thing. Self-empowerment and stepping into our power. The world has flattened them into the same phrase, the same vibe, the same Instagram aesthetic, but they're not the same. They're entirely different fires, and confusing them is one of the reasons we end up stuck, reaching for the wrong fire at the wrong stage. Self-empowerment is the fire of refusal. I no longer want to live like this. I don't know what's on the other side, but I'm done with this side. It runs on no more. It's the willingness to leave, even before we know what we're leaving toward. Stepping into our power is different. That's the fire of becoming. This is who I am, and I'm here to embody it. It runs on yes. It's the inspired claim, the conscious choice of an archetype we're stepping into. And it's real. It's transformative. It's one of the most powerful experiences available to a human being. But it doesn't live here. It lives much later in the path. And here's the architecture underneath the two fires, because this took me a long time to see clearly. Self-empowerment lives at the boundary layer. Stepping into our power lives at the standards layer. Those are two different parts of our internal ecosystem, and they do very different work. At the self-empowerment stage, right here, we're living from our boundaries. We're figuring out who we're not. We're refusing what doesn't fit once it's already in front of us. Thank you, no, I refuse to play that role. I'm not doing that anymore. Every refusal is information about who we are by carving away who we aren't. That's the work at this stage. Not deciding who we want to be, deciding who we're done being. And there's something important to name about how that relates to standards, because the difference is bigger than most of us realize. Boundaries are the work we do when something has already entered our experience. Someone says something disrespectful, and we draw the line. A dynamic shows up again, and we step out of it. A pattern emerges, and we refuse to keep participating in it. That's boundary work. It's reactive in the best sense. It's how we protect ourselves while we're still inside the patterns that shaped us. Standards work upstream of all of that. When we're finally living from our standards, most of what used to require a boundary never gets close enough to require one. People, places, dynamics that don't fit our standards don't even get to be present in our life. It's an automatic no, often before we've consciously processed anything. They never get a seat at the table. They never become someone we have to refuse, because they never made it through the filter in the first place. But we can't live from our standards yet. Not really. Because we have to do the boundary work first. We have to figure out who we're not. We have to refuse what doesn't fit over and over until we know what does. And then we have to do the deeper work that's coming, the shadow work, the body integration, before we have enough clarity and enough internal space to consciously choose what we're standing for. Eventually, much later in this path, we'll be living from our standards, from an inner authority that filters before anything has to be refused, from the conscious yes of who we've decided to be. That's where we're heading, but not today. If we try to live from standards before that work is done, we just end up filtering through someone else's standards, which is exactly what we've been doing. I won't go back to that conversation. I won't smile through that dynamic anymore. I won't be the one who keeps the peace at the cost of myself. I won't keep showing up to a life that doesn't fit just because it's the one I built. That's where the fire lives at this stage, in the won't. And the refusal is sacred. It's the most honest thing many of us have felt in a long time. It doesn't need to be justified. It just needs to be honored. And honoring it isn't a one-time act, because the spark has to become a way of moving through ordinary life, or it stays an idea.
Living from the boundaries, self-trust.
So what does that actually look like day to day? What does it mean to live from the refusal in ordinary life? It looks like self-trust. And self-trust is one of those phrases that sounds soft until we try to actually have it. Most of us don't, not because we're untrustworthy, but because we were taught for decades that our knowing wasn't reliable. We were taught to check with someone else, to run it past a friend, a partner, an expert, a feed full of people who don't know our life. We were trained to source validation externally so consistently that the muscle of trusting ourselves went soft from disuse. So when we try to call on it now, when we try to make a decision from inside instead of outside, there's nothing there. Or what's there feels too quiet to count on. Or it feels like just another voice in a room full of voices, and we can't tell which one is actually ours. Self-trust is the relationship we have with our own knowing, and it doesn't come back through discipline. It comes back through actually letting ourselves live as ourselves. It comes back in the micro decisions we make every day. Saying no to disrespect. Saying no without offering an explanation. Without justifying ourselves. Without softening it so the other person feels better about being told no. Doing what actually aligns with our joy, even when our joy looks unimpressive from the outside. Sometimes that's staying home. Sometimes that's making a small dinner for ourselves and eating it slowly, without nothing to prove and no one to perform for. Sometimes that's coffee and a small breakfast and a podcast in the morning, having a quiet, self-reflective moment that doesn't get posted, doesn't get shared, doesn't become content. It just gets to be ours. This isn't about a to-do list. It isn't about promises we need to keep to ourselves. It's about living our life on our own terms, the terms we'd actually choose if no one was watching, if no one was weighing in, if there was no one to please and no one to disappoint. Most of us have spent so long living a life shaped by other people's preferences that we don't quite know what our own preferences are anymore. So self-trust starts to come back through the small recognitions. I actually want this. I don't actually want that. This brings me alive. This drains me. The honest noticing of what's true for us, and then the small, quiet choice to honor it. That's the muscle. That's how self-empowerment lives day to day. Not through accountability, through alignment. And alignment has a piece underneath it most of us don't realize is there, because we can't refuse what we won't let ourselves feel.
Emotional clarity.
The refusal needs honest contact with what's actually underneath. And most of us lost honest contact with what we're feeling a long time ago. Most of us have access to what we should be feeling. We have access to what's acceptable to feel. We have access to whatever feeling our nervous system has decided is safest in the current room. But the actual feeling, the one underneath the performance of feeling, is often something we lost touch with a long time ago. We say I'm fine when we're not. We say I don't care when we do. We say it doesn't matter when something just got broken inside us, and we don't even know we're doing it. And this is harder than it sounds, because many of us, the feelings underneath the acceptable ones, are the ones we were taught to disown. Anger that wasn't allowed, grief that nobody had room for, desire that got shamed, disappointment that we learned to swallow because expressing it cost us love. Those buried feelings are often where the real refusals live. The anger we weren't allowed to feel is sometimes the anger that's telling us this dynamic has to end. The grief we never gave room is sometimes the grief that's telling us we've been mourning a version of our life that died years ago. The disappointment we swallowed is sometimes the disappointment that's telling us we've been settling. Self-empowerment isn't about expressing every feeling we have. It's about being honest enough with ourselves to know what they are. Because we can't lead as self. We can't feel. We can only manage it. And there's a difference between leading and managing. Leading is in relationship with what's true. Managing is just keeping the lid on. And once we're actually in contact with what's true, we run into the part of self-empowerment nobody warns us about.
The willingness to be the one who's different.
We don't get to change quietly. When we cross the threshold, when we decide we're done living the life that doesn't fit, the people around us don't automatically come with us. Some of them will. Some of them will be ready to grow alongside us. Some of them will surprise us in beautiful ways, but some of them won't. Some of them will need us to stay exactly who we've been. Some of them built their version of the relationship on the role we used to play. And when we stop playing that role, the relationship has to reorganize. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Self-empowerment is the willingness to be the one who's different anyway. The willingness to be the outcast. The willingness to go against the grain. The willingness to say yes to ourselves even when everyone in our life expects us to keep saying yes to them. The willingness to disappoint people we love because the alternative is disappointing ourselves into oblivion. That's a hard thing. It's one of the most painful pieces of this work. We're not just changing for ourselves. We're changing in front of people who knew the old version. We're changing in rooms that haven't reorganized around the new us yet. We're changing while we're still inside the dynamics that shaped the version of us we're letting go of. And we keep going anyways. I am the one willing to be different. I am the one willing to take the step. I am the one willing to find out what's on the other side. Those aren't slogans. Those are the truths we live by while the rest of our life catches up with us. And the catching up looked specific in my own life. So let me share what this actually was, because it wasn't theoretical at all.
What this looked like lived.
This is something I lived. And when I say lived, I mean it cost me almost everything I had built my life around. I left. I walked away from a toxic environment that had been the architecture of my entire life. I walked away from family. I walked away from the criticism, the backbiting, the dark humor, the sarcasm, the complaints, the opinions about who I was and who I should be and what I was allowed to do. I walked away from rooms full of people who had a version of me they needed me to keep playing. And I moved to Florida by myself, knowing no one. I didn't have a plan for who I was going to become. I didn't have a vision. I didn't have an inspired forward pull telling me to go become this beautiful new version of yourself. All I had was the refusal. I'm not doing this anymore. I don't know what's on the other side, but I am done with this side. That's what self-empowerment looked like for me. It looked like packing a life into boxes and driving toward a state where no one knew me. It looked like being okay with being alone for a long time, because the alone was cleaner than the noise I was leaving behind. It looked like ignoring the criticism while I made the decisions, ignoring it while I made the move, ignoring it for years after, because the criticism was never going to stop coming from people whose version of me I'd refused to keep performing. And here's what surprised me. Once I got to Florida, the new version of myself didn't immediately arrive. It couldn't, because I was still carrying everything I'd brought with me, the identities that had been put on me, the opinions about who I was, the voices in my head that didn't sound like mine, but that I'd been hearing for so long, I'd forgotten they weren't mine. So the first stretch wasn't becoming, it was excavating. I had a lot of dumping to do, a lot of getting rid of identities that had been put on me, a lot of looking at what I was carrying and asking, is this mine? Did I choose this? Or did someone else hand this to me and call it me? That's the work of self-empowerment. It isn't building, it's clearing. It's, I'm not this, I'm not that. I'm not the version of me my family needed me to be. I'm not the opinions I was raised on. I'm not the role I was given. One no at a time. One identity at a time. One inherited piece dropped at a time. It took a long time. It wasn't quick. It wasn't tidy. There were a lot of moments when I couldn't tell what was mine yet because I'd just gotten rid of so much that the inside felt empty. And sitting with that emptiness, without rushing to fill it with whoever I thought I was supposed to become next, that was part of the work too. The becoming came later, much later, after the shadow work, after learning how to live in my body instead of just managing it, after enough excavation had happened that I could actually see what was left when the inherited material has been cleared out. That's when stepping into my power became available. But it never would have happened if I hadn't left first. If I hadn't said, I don't know who I am becoming, but I know who I'm done being. The leaving made everything else possible. The fire that carried me through wasn't inspiration. It was refusal. And in the meantime, while the rebuilding is still slow, while the becoming is still far off, something does shift in the day-to-day.
The shift that becomes possible.
It's often the first sign that the boundary layer is actually online. Our decisions become simple, almost shockingly simple. They get based on the best decision we can make for our life in this moment with what we know. And they stop being catastrophic. They stop being huge. They stop being a mountain we have to climb every time. There's no guilt around them. There's no shame about them. It's just, this is what it is. You don't get to talk to me like that. Decision made. The decision to draw that line, to get up and leave, to end the conversation, it becomes as simple as recognizing we need to go to the restroom. Nobody's opinions need to weigh in on whether we need to go to the bathroom. Our body is always letting us know what's actually happening in the environment. There was a time we couldn't make a decision without checking with everyone first. That time is shifting. The need for validation softens. We stop reaching for it. We stop checking. We just get quiet, align with what's true for us, and move from there. We start to be the same person across rooms. The continuity we couldn't quite hold before starts to hold. We stop forgetting who we are when we walk into different environments. And we stop confusing other people's discomfort with our wrongness. Someone being unhappy with our decision stops being evidence that we made a bad decision. It just becomes evidence that they're unhappy. Those are two different things. This isn't a transformation that announces itself. It's not loud. It's not dramatic. It's the quiet, settled clarity of finally living a life that's actually ours. And that quiet clarity is what carries us into the work ahead.
Why this has to come first.
Everything ahead of us in this path, the shadow work, the body integration, the archetypes, the sovereign consciousness, none of it works without this level. Because everything ahead of us is going to ask something of us. Each level asks us to stay in the room with work that takes real fire, to investigate the unconscious patterns we formed for survival and approval, to let our body and nervous system actually catch up to what our mind has been understanding, to meet the archetypal patterns moving through us with discernment instead of getting lost in them, to eventually live from the internal authority instead of external validation. And none of that happens without the willingness we're building right now. None of that happens without fire, without the willingness. We won't sit through shadow work. We'll spiral. We'll quit. We'll find a reason to step back from the work the moment it gets uncomfortable. Without the refusal at the bottom of it, the depth work becomes another thing we tried that didn't stick. Self-empowerment is what makes the rest of this path survivable. It's the fire we carry into the work that's coming. It's what keeps us in the room when staying gets hard. There's also a structural truth about this stage worth naming. Once we cross the threshold, we can't go back. The version of ourselves that didn't know what we know now doesn't exist anymore. We can pretend we don't know. We can perform our way back into the old shape for a while, but the knowing doesn't unhappen. Once we've seen what we've seen, the old life starts to feel wrong, because it is. That's why so many of us stall here, because part of us knows what crossing is going to cost. So we circled the threshold for years. We do enough work to feel like we're moving, but not enough to actually cross. We keep one foot in the old life and one foot in the new, and we wonder why nothing is changing. But the crossing is the change. There isn't a way to half cross. We either step or we don't. And that step isn't built through practice. It's built through yes. The yes we say to ourselves when no one else is asking us to. The yes that crosses the threshold, even when we can't see the other side. I am the one who changes, and I'm willing to find out what that means. That yes is the empowerment. That yes is level 1. So where does that leave us today? The step, we don't have to do all of this in one episode, but we do get to be honest with ourselves about whether we're standing at the threshold or whether we've crossed it. Standing at the threshold is okay. That's where most of us live for a long time before we cross. The threshold is sacred too. but it matters to know that's where we are, because circling the threshold and pretending we've crossed is one of the longest ways to stall a life. So somewhere this week, you might find yourself sitting with these questions, not as an exercise, just as a quiet mirror. Have I actually crossed yet? Or am I negotiating with a version of my life I already know doesn't fit? What am I still saying yes to that I'm done with? What's the no that's been waiting to be spoken? There's no wrong answer to any of these. There's only the honest one. And from that honesty, our life starts to quietly rearrange itself around what's actually true for us, one refusal at a time, one real preference at a time, one quiet act of living on our own terms at a time. That's the work of level 1. That's the self-empowerment at the core. It's not flashy. It's not motivational, but it's the work that changes everything. You are the one who decides to cross. You always were. I'll see you next week when we step into level 2, shadow work. I'm going to pause here and let this land. If something in this resonated, you don't need to do anything with it. Just sit with it and notice what continues to unfold. Thank you for listening and for being here with me.